and on Facebook. So I do hope that the connection is going to work. I hope that you've all packed your suitcases ready for literary travels tonight. I'm going to be asking what's in your literary suitcase. And I'm going to be telling you all about my favourite literary travel fiction. One of the things that I wanted to ponder tonight, thinking about bibliotherapy and travel fiction, is what is it that we're looking for in a book when we want to travel somewhere? For people that haven't joined before, I'm Ella Beartoo, and I am the resident bibliotherapist of Damien Barr's Literary Salon. And we have been doing literary salons at the Savoy Hotel for the last couple of years, and previously at many other places around London and indeed the world. I've been on many literary travels with Damien when we've done reading weekends in exotic and far-flung locations such as Antigua and Palm Island. Oh, for traveling to such gorgeous places once again. Because of the current COVID crisis, we've been doing bibliotherapy online for the last few months. And I'm really happy to be carrying on with live bibliotherapy sessions until the end of this year. So the theme tonight is literary travels, and I would really love to know, what are your favourite literary travels? It's really nice to see lots of lovely people here with me tonight on both Facebook and Instagram. Ollie, great to see you again from Tel Aviv. Hi, Lorraine. Hi, lots of people that I haven't met before. It's lovely to have you all here tonight. And I would love you to send in your comments and thoughts about what are the kind of books that you go to when you're looking for escape, but also not so much escape. This is not a session about escapist fiction. It's more about where you want to go traveling through a novel while sitting in your own favourite reading nook. I wonder if what we're looking for when we think about literary travels is something that's not just escapism, but is also something exotic, something different, something beyond your usual ken, something that's different from what is outside your own back door. But some of us also like to travel within our own countries in the novels that we turn to for our literary travels. So I'm going to be touching on a lot of these different types of books tonight, but inevitably they're going to be the books that I personally love the most and that are my own favourites. So all the more reason for you to tell me what are your favourites and what you would put in your own literary suitcase. I think sometimes when we're looking for places to go on our literary travels, we want to go somewhere incredibly hot or incredibly cold. But also, besides that, we want a very intense sense of place, a kind of detailed, different normality to what we're used to when we walk outside our doors. How do authors achieve this sense of place, and how do they get that very unique sense of difference and tangibility? That's what we're looking for, a tangible sense of place in different fiction. I think authors all have different ways of doing it, but one of the things that a really brilliant author will do when taking you to another place is to use all of the senses. They'll use a sense of smell, a sense of taste, a sense of hearing, and of course, vision and touch. And these are some of the things that I'm going to be thinking about when I look at the various books that I'm talking about tonight. Often when we read books that take us to different places, they use unfamiliar words, which might be from a foreign language to our own language, or they might be made up words. It could be a kind of fantasy or sci-fi type novel, which uses a very unique language made up by the author. One of the books that I'm going to be talking about tonight does exactly that. The author conjures all these different senses using the gifts of any great writer. And I've chosen books that I particularly love for the reasons of this sensuality. But I'd love to know, what are your favourite reads? Good evening, Jane. Great to see you here on Facebook. And hello to all the lovely people on Instagram too. I will try and respond to you on both platforms. Forgive me if I don't. If I can't reply to you this evening, then I will get back to you later after the session. So I wonder, with your kinds of favourite travel fiction, would they be reads from your childhood? Would they be from your distant past? Would they be books that had a great impact on you, perhaps, when you were a child? Hi, Sam. Great to see you too. I wonder what your favourite literary travel books are. Do tell. Or are they not the type of books that you read as a child? Are they books that you read in the recent past? Are they books that have only just come out? Of course, there's always amazing books coming out all around the world, and which take you to different exotic locations, or even just to a place around the corner which might seem exotic in these strange times. I must say that I've spent a lot of time over the last few weeks of lockdown exploring beyond my back door and seeing it in ways that I've never seen it before. So do tell me what you think are your favourite literary travels. Now, I'm going to open up my literary suitcase and find out what's inside to talk about with you tonight. I know that all of you will have very different things in your own suitcases, which might be purely metaphorical at this time, because a lot of people haven't been able to travel this year, or if they have been traveling, they might have been traveling not so far away. I'm going to start with A House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul, which is a book which has a lot of significance to me personally, because I lived in Trinidad myself, and V.S. Naipaul is a Trinidadian writer. So for me, this is one of my favourite literary travel pieces of fiction, because I first read it, in fact, when I was in Trinidad, when I was about 18. But this was written in 1960, before I was born. And it is a really amazingly vivid book that takes you to the small island of Trinidad, where V.S. Naipaul himself did grow up, and which he left as an adult and came to England. It's a book which is all about Mr. Biswas, a boy who comes from a very poor family, who are as a child, he's destined to just be a manual labourer. But it's about how he manages to overcome his poor background and actually learn to read and write. And eventually he becomes a journalist. So it is a kind of parallel to the life of Vidyadhar Naipaul himself, but it is actually very different. And some would say it's quite a sad book, because Mr. Biswas dies age 46, and we know that from the very start of the book. The first couple of paragraphs are about his death, so he hasn't had a very long life. And although it's called A House for Mr. Biswas, all the houses that he actually lives in are really not grand. They're frequently owned by other people, and they're often falling apart. But the reason that I love the book, and I recommend it to all of you to read, is because it's a book that takes you into very different states of mind and shows you the life and times of a young man growing up. It's a kind of Bildungsroman that takes you through the entire life of one man, and it's very sympathetic to him, and it has a very strong, dark humour. I'm going to read you a couple of passages from it just to give you a bit of a flavour of the book. Whenever afterwards Mr. Biswas thought of Green Vale, he thought of the trees. They were tall and straight, and so hung with long drooping leaves that their trunks were hidden and appeared to be branchless. Half the leaves were dead, the others at the top were a dead green. It was as if all the trees had, at the same moment, been blighted in luxuriance, and death was spreading at the same pace from all the roots. But death was forever held in check. The tongue-like leaves of dead green turned slowly to the brightest yellow, became brown and thin as if scorched, curled downwards over the other dead leaves, and did not fall. And new leaves came, as sharp as daggers, but there was no freshness to them. They came into the world old, without a shine, and only grew longer before they too died. It was hard to imagine that beyond the trees on every side lay the clear plain. Green Vale was damp and shadowed and close. The trees darkened the road and their rotting leaves choked the grass gutters. That's all quite depressing, it has to be said. But the book itself is not a depressing book. It's actually a book which has very funny moments. And it's a book that really makes you feel a bit of a Dickensian sense of grittiness and detail in the jungle and the streets and the houses where Mr. Biswas lives. He's actually called Mr. Biswas even from when he's born. When he's a baby, he's Mr. Biswas, which is quite strange, but it makes you feel very affectionate towards the young Biswas. I'll just read you a little bit more to give you this amazing sense of detail and place, which is the reason that I love the book so much. He played at his house with his sister, Dehuti. They mixed yellow earth with water and made mud fireplaces. They cooked a few grains of rice in empty condensed milk tins, and using the tops of tins as baking stones, they made rotis. Rotis, by the way, are some of the most delicious Trinidadian food that I've ever had. They're a kind of lovely pastry that some of you might have had, and they put things like goat or potatoes and ladies' fingers inside, and you can get them as street food. They're so good. In these amusements, Prasad and Pratap took no part. 9 and 11, respectively, they were past such frivolities and had already begun to work. These are Mr. Biswas's older siblings, joyfully cooperating with the estates in breaking the law about the employment of children. They had developed adult mannerisms. They spoke with blades of grass between their teeth. They drank noisily and sighed, passing the back of their hands across their mouths. They ate enormous quantities of rice, patted their bellies and belched, and every Saturday they stood up in line to draw their pay. Their job was to look after the buffaloes that drew the cane carts. The Buffalo's Pleasance was a muddy, cloyingly sweet pool not far from the factory. Here, with another dozen thin-limbed boys, noisy, happy, over-energetic, and with a full sense of their importance, Pratap and Prasad moved all day in the mud along the buffaloes. When they came home, their legs were caked with the buffalo mud, which on drying had turned white, so that they looked like the trees in fire stations and police stations, which are washed with white lime up to the middle of their trunks. I won't carry on with all that because I've got several books to talk about, but I really love the visual detail, the sense of smells and sounds as well. And it's also, it has to be said now, an exotic kind of read because I don't live in Trinidad anymore. Now I live in the UK where we don't have buffalo fields or mud that's going to dry white on our shins in most places anyway. So to me, it now seems far more exotic than it did when I actually lived in Trinidad. But it is a really fantastic read. It is long. It's about 500 pages long. So it's a bit of a book to embark on. But if you fancy a book that's going to take you to a hot, sultry island full of jungle is a place of decay. It is a place of rotting leaves, but it's also a place of hummingbirds. There are 272 different kinds of hummingbirds in Trinidad, and you get the incredible sense of colour and animal life and bird life in all of Naipaul's books. I think in the end he wrote at least 20 books, and A House for Mr. Biswas is one of his earliest books, and I think it's probably his best. So I'd strongly recommend it. Also, the fact that it was written in 1960 makes it all the more intriguing and takes you back to another era. So moving on from Trinidad to a slightly less exotic location, I want to take you to August by Gerard Woodward. This is obviously relevant now because we are in August, and I'm bringing it up now because it's a book set in the UK, and it's all about a family who go back to the same field in Wales every year from 1955 to 1970. And they first stumble across it when the dad, Aldous Jones, is going on a cycling holiday, and he falls over his handlebars into a field, and he feels that when he's fallen over into this field that this is some kind of fate, and that this means that he and his family should go and stay there. So backtracking slightly, it starts off before he and his wife are actually pregnant. He's a young man at that point, and they start bringing their young children to this field in Wales, where it's only owned by a farmer. They rent it off him, and as the years go by, the farmer asks for more money and it all gets a bit more complicated. But the family live in London most of the time, and Aldous, the dad, feels like there's a strange parallel between the field in Wales and their location in North London. The reason I love the book is partly because we as a family have a similar experience of going to the same place every August. The place we go to is in Cornwall, and actually I've just come back from there, hence my slightly tanned look. And I feel a kinship with the Jones family in this novel by Gerard Woodward because we go back to the same field every year. It's not quite the same. It is an official campsite. It has to be said. It's not just somebody's field, but there's something about that yearly visit where we as a family change, but the field itself doesn't change very much at all. And every year when you go back with your family, you're very much aware of how the children have grown up, whether you have different pets with you. In this book, the Jones family take their cat with them every year until it finally dies and it roams around the field, which is rather sweet. But what makes it a great book, and not just a book about a family in a field in Wales, is that the family is slowly unraveling during these 15 years because the mother, Colette, has some kind of a breakdown as she realizes that her own real life is not matching up to the kind of life that she imagined for herself. And this is all actually becomes quite tragic because she starts sniffing glue, which is quite terrible to witness and very sad indeed. And they also have a son, Janus, who's very problematic. He is destined to be a great pianist. He doesn't live up to the expectations of his family. And slowly we see the family coming apart. But it's actually a book which is full of hope and love and family dynamics, which make it a really good read. I'm going to read you a little section of it so that you will have a flavour of this book too. When they arrived at their field, the third field down from the road, reached by a double bend at the end of the farmyard, through a red gate, and over a narrow, bright stream by means of a plank bridge, she felt she was being shown around an enormous drawing room. And this is the grass in small hillocks, except for the flat area where the tent is pitched. And these are our walls, tastefully hung with mosses and lichens. And this is the orange barrow that last made hay a century ago. And these are the scattered monoliths that might be the remains of a Bronze Age burial site. And this is the bare patch under the hawthorn clump, littered with flecks of wool and round conglomerates of sheep dung, like magnified blackberries, that mark the favoured resting site of the sheep that sometimes live in the field. And here is the view we enjoy, the horn of chimneys and spires that is Languifinia, and above it the domed mass of Muilthry. Sorry about my Welsh pronunciation, which is definitely not right. Colette's heart lifted when she saw their tent occupying this place. It was on the far side of the field, its fly sheet pegged to the grass on long guy ropes. It looked like the single sail of a ship come adrift from its vessel to be fastened to the world. It looked like a fallen kite or an early and unsuccessful attempt at a flying machine. When she unlaced its entrance and recognised some of the furnishings of Fernlight Avenue, a blanket, some books, a framed photograph of herself taken 20 years ago, all lit with green, she felt she was discovering the lost treasure of her own life. That's one of the things I love about this novel, is anyone who's camped will completely relate to the way that Woodward describes camping, the way that there's the familiar within your own tent and the unfamiliar around you. And there's a really beautiful image at the end of the book of one of the grandchildren in the tent who asks to be left in the tent when they take the tent down, and he's left standing under the canvas like a strange lump under the tent. And that's one of the things that all of us can remember probably doing as camping. So if you're someone that likes camping on holiday, this is a great book, but it's also a book not just for campers, because it's very much about a family and their dynamics, and it has that lovely sense of nostalgia for your own childhood, and perhaps if you have children, for the childhood of your children. There's that sense of every year looking back on the treasures that are being created as memories this year. So moving on to the next book in my travel suitcase here, I'm going to get out Cold Mountain by Charles Frazier, which is a rather wonderful book that many of you might have read already, because it was a massive bestseller when it first came out. I think it sold 3 million copies. It's set during the American Civil War, and it's a kind of odyssey. So many people would say that with travel fiction, one of the key books of travel fiction is the Odyssey itself. And many books that are travel fiction now relate and make deliberate nods to the Odyssey itself, which Charles Frazier's first novel definitely does. It's a book set during the American Civil War, and it tells the story of a man called Inman, who's a deserter from the Confederate Army, who at the beginning of the book is in hospital recovering from his wounds, and he decides that he's had enough of fighting for a cause that he doesn't believe in, and he decides he's going to go home. And he then embarks on an enormous journey across America, searching for the love of his life, whose name is Ada, and she lives at Cold Mountain, which is where he comes from. It's a harsh, tragic book which has a lot of references to nature and to the lack of personalization in nature, the fact that nature has no sense of justice to mankind. And there's a lot of brutal reality in this book. It shows an impervious world to the reader. But it's also an incredibly romantic book. And I'm going to read you a section which brings out, I think, both of these ideas, I hope. Before I read it to you, I'm just going to have a little drink of my holiday drink, channeling the travel vibes. And I hope that any of you that are with me tonight are also having some kind of holiday type drink, maybe a cocktail or a Diet Coke in my case, which is actually something I do associate with holidays and travel for some reason. So this section is when Inman is getting quite close to Cold Mountain and to his ultimate destination to find the love of his life. Some days later, Inman climbed all morning, not really knowing where he was. Mists moved ahead of him like deer through the trees. And then, for the afternoon, he walked a ridge-line trail that rolled between balsam highlands and little gladed gaps where stood beech groves and the tail ends of cove hardwoods as they reached the highest places where they could live. As he walked, he began to suspect that he knew roughly where he was. It was an old passway, that much was clear. He passed a rock cairn that the Cherokee in times long past were in the habit of building along the way to signify something, although whether waymarker or memorial or holy place was now unknowable. Inman picked up a fresh rock and dropped it on the pile in passing as commemoration of some old upward yearning. Late in the day, he found himself on a rocky scrap bordered by heath bald, a thick tangle of waist-high azalea and laurel and myrtle growing right to the bare rock of the ledge. The trail emptied onto it as if travellers had made a custom of stopping to admire the view. Then the way re-entered the forest through a faint passage in the azalea, not 40 feet from where he had emerged. The sun was falling, and Inman reckoned he would again make a bivouac without benefit of fire or water. In the space near the edge of the scarp, he scraped together what little duff there was to soften a sleeping place. He ate parched corn from his palm and stretched out in his bedding to sleep, wishing there were a bigger moon in the sky to light the prospect before him. He was awakened at first grey dawn by the sound of walking in the heath. He sat up and set the lamat, which is a gun, by the way, on full cock and levelled it at the sound. In a minute, a black sow bear poked her head through the leaves, not 20 feet from where Inman sat. She stood, tan muzzle up, neck stretched long, sniffing the breeze and blinking her little eyes. She did not like what she smelled. A single cub, not much bigger than a man's head, climbed a little way up the trunk of a young Fraser fir behind her, but not... Inman knew that with her poor sight she could smell him, but not see him in the faint light. She was in fact so near that even with his man's poor nose, he could mark her scent. Wet dog and something deeper. The bear twice woofed out air from nose and mouth and moved forward tentatively. Inman shifted about and stood, and the bear pricked up her ears. She blinked and stretched her neck again and sniffed and moved another step forward. Inman set the pistol down on his bedding, for he had taken upon himself a vow to never again shoot one, though he had killed and eaten many in his youth, and knew that he had still in him a strong liking for the flavour of bear grease. Don't we all? The decision came as a result of a series of dreams he had over the period of a week in the muddy trenches of Petersburg. In the first of the dreams, he had started as a man. He was sick and drank tea from bearberry leaves as tonic, and gradually he became transformed into a black bear. During the nights, the bear visions rode him. Inman roamed the green dream mountains alone and four-legged, avoiding all of his own kind and of other kinds. He rooted in the ground for pale grubs and tore at bee trees for honey and ate huckleberries by the bushful and was happy and strong. In that manner of life, he thought There might be a lesson in how to wage peace and heal the wounds of war into white scars. In the final dream, though, he was shot by hunters after a long chase. He was strung from a tree by a rope about his neck and skinned, and he watched the process as from above. His dripping red carcass was, as he knew an actual bear's to be after skinning. That is to say, manlike, thinner than one would expect, the structure of paws beneath the fur long like a man's hand. With that killing, the dreams had run their course, and he awoke that last morning feeling bear was an animal of particular import to him, one he might observe and learn from, and that it would be on the order of a sin for him to kill one, no matter what the expense, for there was something in bear that spoke to him of hope. Still, he did not much favour his current position, backed up against the brow of the rocky ledge, the heath knotted up before him, and the sow nervous with a cub born out of season. In his favour was this: he knew a bear was much more likely to run than attack, that she might at most make a false charge, rushing forward 15 feet or so, bouncing as she came on her front legs and snorting out air. The purpose would be to scare him off, not to hurt him. But he had nowhere to run. He wanted her to know where he was, so he spoke to her, saying, "I've no aim to trouble you. I'll walk on from here and never be back. I'm just asking for clear passage." He spoke calm and straight, and he wanted his voice to convey respect. The bear sniffed more. She shifted from foot to foot, rocked from side to side. Inman slowly rolled up his bedding and slipped on his sacks. "I'll be going," he said. He moved 2 steps and the bear false charged. Inman could figure in his mind, as it happened, that none of the measurements would work out, like a problem of carpentry where none of the dimensions match up. He had only 3 feet to back up. She had all the momentum of her bulk and only 10 feet ahead of her before the lip of the cliff. Inman took a step to the side and the bear rushed by him and plunged over the high edge that she never saw in the gloom. He could smell her strong as she went by. Wet dog, black dirt. I'm actually not going to carry on because it's quite an intense passage. But, and I don't want you to know what happens, but it is very, very gripping, powerful. And we travel with Inman over many, many weeks and many, many miles through the wilderness of North Carolina and other states. And I think it's one of the most vivid pieces of travel fiction that you can possibly read. It's a really good read. And actually, the audiobook read by Charles Frazier himself is also really excellent. And he's got a lovely voice. So one of the things that is interesting about that book is the aspect of the dream, which I think is something that does come into a lot of very vivid fiction in which travel is a major part of the content. So thinking about Aboriginal literature and the dreaming, for instance, there's also Tim Winton's book, The Shepherd's Hut, which has a lot of very powerful dreams in it. And the dreams which the characters have in the books often bring their subconscious into the story and make the story all the more believable when we enter into the subconsciousness of the characters. And that's one of the reasons that fiction can be so compelling, because it actually gets into your own subconscious and helps you to effect a change and have a kind of sea change and almost change of personality, because the book gets right under your skin. Someone's just mentioning their favourite travel books. Travels with Charlie, which is one of the books I was thinking about discussing tonight by Steinbeck, which is a fantastic book, Heather. Thank you for that. And that's a book all about travels with a dog around America. It's a kind of memoir, and in which the hero is traveling with his large and lovely dog. And that is an excellent one. Thank you, Heather, which is a really good one to talk about too. And I'd love other people to tell me your thoughts too. I have had some people talking about books from India, and somebody commented earlier on Facebook about Shantaram by Gregory David Roberts, which is an amazingly vivid, compelling book that takes you into prisons in India. It covers you in lice as a main character. It is very swashbuckling at times with lots of intense adventures. And it's one of those books that is pretty impossible to put down. I know a lot of people that love it, as do I. And talking of books set in India, there's also one of my favourite authors is R.K. Narayan, who wrote a whole series of books all about the fictional place in South India called Malgudi. And one of my favourite books in that series is called The Guide by R.K. Narayan, which is all about a man who is a guide. He starts off as a railway guide, and he then becomes, throughout the book, a very different kind of guide, which I don't want to reveal because it would be a spoiler. But R.K. Narayan, he's a lovely writer. I think he died about 30 years ago, but in his time in India, he was very famous, and lots of his books were actually made into a TV series called Malgudi Days. And I would really recommend The Guide, which for me is his best book, and it's very vivid. It very much takes you onto the streets of the fictional town in South India, but it's obviously based on real places. Before we stop, though, I've got a couple more books in my suitcase, and somebody, Trevor on Facebook, thanks for coming, Trevor, mentioned fantasy books that he read as a child, including Mervyn Peake, Alan Garner, love Alan Garner, he's fantastic, set in Cornwall. And he's also mentioning some of the books he read as an adult, which have also been very important to him, such as D.H. Lawrence, Jean Rhys, Jan Morris. So thanks a lot for mentioning those. But I've got a couple more that I want to bring in that I haven't spoken about yet. So one of these is The Passion by Jeanette Winterson, which is all set in Venice. It's a really vivid and evocative and highly sensual book, which intertwines the destinies of two very different people. One is a simple French soldier who follows Napoleon from his glory to the ruins of Russia, and the other character is Villanelle, who is red-haired, web-footed, and Venetian, and she is the daughter of a Venetian boatman. It's a book full of carnival, dance, chance, and darkness, and it's very much a Jeanette Winterson classic. I'd like to just read you a tiny bit from her intro, which gives you a really good idea of the kind of thing that she's trying to do. She says, I wanted to write a separate world, not as an escape, as a mirror, a secret looking glass that would sharpen and multiply the possibilities of the actual world. Hold it up and your own face is there, disguised in time and place, disguised into another chance. The passion is not history, except in so much as all our lives are history. The passion is not romance, except in so much as all our lives are marked by the men and women with whom we fell in love. This is a very beautifully written, highly sensual, and very evocative book. And I'll just read you a little bit. I know this will be a much shorter passage than the Charles Brazier, because that was quite a long one. But it gives you a little glimpse of her brilliant powers to evoke a place. I love the night. In Venice, a long time ago, when we had our own calendar and stayed aloof from the world, we began the days at night. What use was the sun to us when our trade and our secrets and our diplomacy depended on darkness? In the dark, you are in disguise, and this is a city of disguises. In those days, I cannot place them in time because time is to do with daylight. In those days, when the sun went down, we opened our doors and slid along the eely waters with a hooded light in our prow. All our boats were black then and left no mark on the water where they sat. We were dealing in perfume and silk, emeralds and diamonds, affairs of state. We didn't build our bridges simply to avoid walking on water. Nothing so obvious. A bridge is a meeting place, a neutral place, a casual place. Enemies will choose to meet on a bridge and end their quarrel in that void. One will cross to the other side. The other will not return. For lovers, a bridge is a possibility, a metaphor of their chances. And for the traffic in whispered goods, where else but a bridge in the night? There's so much more I could read, but I am going to stop because there's a couple of other books that I want to mention. But this is a great example of magic realism, which is one of the genres that people often turn to as an escape. Colleen, you've just asked for my email address. It's ella@ellabear2.com. So do send me messages. I would love to hear from you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about your favourite travels in fiction. Magical realism is, as I was saying, one of the great ways to go when it comes to travel in fiction. And many people have been mentioning Isabel Allende as one of their favourite authors, who takes them to exciting locations which are exotic for people who don't live in South America. Also, Haruki Murakami is another great writer who uses magical realism to bring an extra layer of intrigue to the places that he goes in literature. Now, another fantastic book, which is of a slightly different genre, is this quite big tome, The Book of Strange New Things by Michel Faber, which is, like all of Michel Faber's books, quite indefinable by genre, but it is a kind of science fiction because it's about a man of God who goes to another planet to preach the word of God. He's sent by his church to a planet called Oasis, and there his job is to attempt to convert the race of people that live there, who are aliens by our standards, to the word of God. And the reason I chose this to talk about tonight is because it's a book that has an amazingly vivid sense of place, which is very interesting because it's clearly entirely made up. So it's unlike the books that we've been discussing so far, which are all based on real places, from Jeanette Winterson's Venice to Charles Frazier's America to Gerard Woodward's Wales to V.S. Naipaul's Trinidad. So with Michel Faber, it's a completely invented location. And there's lots of things I love about this book. It's partly the language which he invents, which is strangely believable. And the way that Michel Faber writes about language very much reminds me of the short story by Ted Chiang called The Story of Your Life, which was made into the film Arrival, which is all about an alien race bringing a new universal language to Earth. And I think Michel Faber does a very similar thing in this book with the way that he writes about language, because it's something very much on a higher plane that you can completely believe in. So there's the whole language thing going on. There's also the fact that the priest is having huge doubts about his religion. He's left his wife on Earth, and Earth is going through a lot of major changes excuse me, with the cat. It's actually having massive droughts and floods. The Maldives go underwater during the book. It's all quite epic and very much a book of spiritual crisis, really. But it's also a book with great sense of location. Hello, cat. We're going to have to put you down, sorry. So I just want to read you a tiny bit of this because one of the things I think is amazing about Michel Faber in all of his books, from The Crimson Petal and the White to The Book of Strange New Things, is that they have an amazing amount of detail in them. The rains were about a quarter of a mile away, gaining ground fast. They truly were rains, plural. 3 colossal networks of water were advancing independently, separated by substantial spaces of clear air. Each network had its own internal logic, replicating and reassembling its glittering patterns over and over, shifting slow and graceful, like one of those complex computer graphics that purport to show a city or a spider web in 3 dimensions from all angles. Except that here, the screen was the sky, and the display was an awe-inspiring vista on a par with an aurora borealis or a nuclear mushroom cloud. If only B could see this, he thought. B is his wife. Every day, provoked by some event or other, he regretted her absence. It wasn't a physical yearning. That came and went, and it was at an ebb just now. But rather an uneasy awareness that a huge, complicated phase of his life was passing by, crowded with significant and deeply emotional experiences, none of which B was seeing, none of which he was remotely involved in. And again now, these 3 great shimmering veils of rain, swirling majestically across the plains towards him. They were indescribable, and he would not describe them, but seeing them would leave a mark on him, a mark that would not be left on her. I love the way he describes those rains. You can really picture it, and it's the weirdness, the alienness, the strangeness of them that makes the whole book completely believable. It is another big book, but it's not a difficult read. It's one that pulls you along because you're dying to know what's going to happen to the priest as he goes through his strange situation. So I'm aware that we're coming up to an hour, and there's so many more books to mention, and I'd still love to hear any of your thoughts if any of you have other books that you want to mention. Bettina's mentioned Heat and Dust, which is another brilliant book set in India. Thanks for that. That is another one that is incredibly powerful and evocative. And by the way, I will put a list of all the books that I've talked about and all the ones that you've mentioned too onto both Facebook and Instagram, so that if there's any that you thought, ooh, I'd love to read that, and didn't quite catch the title, then they will be here, so don't panic. There's just a couple more that I'd love to briefly mention. This is one of my favourites, A Theatre for Dreamers by Polly Sampson, which is all set on the Greek island of Hydra, and it's about a love triangle between Axel Jensen, Marianne Elan, and Leonard Cohen. And this is a book which completely makes you want to dive into the waters of Hydra and rush off to a Greek island the minute you can. It's so sensual and beautiful and dripping with gorgeous golden sunshine. It is a holiday in itself. I would very much recommend that as a great read. The Colour of Heaven by James Runcie is another amazingly lovely book set in the 14th century, which is all about the search for the colour of heaven by a boy who's working as an apprentice to an artist who's trying to create murals. And this book takes you through, it takes you from Venice, again, we love a bit of Venice, to Afghanistan and China. and it explores the value of travel itself. So that's one of the great things about like this book. It is a kind of travel book through these amazing locations in the 14th century. And one of the great things about it too is that the main character, who's a young boy who's about 17, has terrible eyesight, and he's actually really handicapped by his terrible eyesight, because you can imagine in the days before glasses, what did you do if you couldn't see? And it describes not just his search for lapis, which he does find in the end, you'll be glad to hear, but also for a pair of lenses to help him to see, and the descriptions of his blurry eyesight. And then when he does get some lenses made for him, the transformation to actually being able to see is a really beautiful thing. And this is, in a way, an easier read than some of the other books that I've been mentioning. It's not very long, but it is a really beautiful, uplifting book. Many have called it intoxicating, and it really does evoke the beauty of the lapis lazuli. It's also full of love and romance, and all in all, it's a great read. Then, there's others I want to mention, but I know I can't go on all night. This book, it came out a while back by Peter Høeg, the Danish writer, The Woman and the Ape. I just wanted to mention it because it's gotten a really amazing description of London in it, when this ape is running through London with the heroine, Madeline, and they are having a kind of love affair. I know, it's bizarre. Appetite Book Club. Hello, you're saying you love that. I imagine you're talking about this book, which is great if so. It is an excellent book, isn't it? And it's just unlike anything else I've ever read. I'll just read you a tiny bit because I am aware that we're running out of time. Until this moment, Madeline had always pictured the British capital as the city liked to think of itself, as a nerve centre of sleepless, hyperactive vitality. Now she discerned a truer picture. Looking into these faces, devoid of all suspicion, she saw that the city had its head in the clouds, that despite its 7 million people, its telephones, its never-ending supply of energy, its feverish activity, its streams of nutrients and effluent, its mind was quite simply elsewhere, that it hung suspended in a permanent and only spasmodically interrupted absence. Through this gigantic urban daydream, the ape moved like a circus performer high above a stunned audience. Where a human being pulling up short would be caught off balance just for an instant, the ape could stiffen, even when running, even halfway through a turn, and hold itself still as a statue. If a figure suddenly appeared in a doorway, if a face behind a window was turned in their direction, it would freeze into inertness, and always in such situations some escape route would present itself, a ledge behind which to duck, or a drainpipe to drop into, as though the animal itself were creating the world through which it moved. Eyes blank with concentration, it executed a sequence of movements in which the city provided it with a backdrop, while at the same time it was capable, quite suddenly, of becoming one with a grey wall, a ventilation shaft, or the shadow of a chimney pot. This book has some incredible descriptions of the ape and the landscape around the ape and the woman who becomes his unlikely mate. But it's a really interesting story about, in many ways, animal rights, language again, because the ape actually learns to speak English, and camouflage. That's one of the key themes of the book, is the way that the ape manages to camouflage himself in the city, in a way purely because people don't expect to see a huge ape leaping across the sky, going from roof to roof and past their windows in the middle of the night. So thinking about travel in fiction, one of the things I'd just like to mention before we stop is the idea of taking your books on an adventure. So taking the actual books on an adventure. I've spoken in the past on some of these salon evenings about how it's a wonderful thing to try and read in exotic locations or in different places, like on a paddleboard or up a tree or on a horse. And if any of you are thinking of doing anything like that, then please do send me photos, because I'd love to see any of you reading in slightly different or unusual locations. By the way, hi, Bill and Jen. Great to see you here. And thanks for mentioning that you've read The Colour of Heaven and used it in art lessons. It's that kind of book which is very inspiring to make you think about art. It's all about art as much as it's about travel too. So going back to reading in exotic locations, one of the things that I talk about in my book, The Art of Mindful Reading, is reading both in different places, but also at different times of the day as a way of reinvigorating your love of reading. So, for instance, nighttime reading. I don't just mean reading in bed. I'll explain through this extract. Reading in bed in adulthood can become a sure way to nod off within a couple of pages. Be mindful of your nighttime reading options in order to keep yourself awake and read in a more childlike, absorbed fashion. Take a torch to bed and read under the covers. Yes, this may seem absurd, but try it. It will take you back to nights of illicit reading when your parents thought you were asleep. Enjoy the addiction of turning over the pages, trying not to wake up your partner as they sleep. Don't tell your children, if you have some at home. If they catch you, they will be at it too. But maybe if you do catch them at it, turn a blind eye. After all, we want our kids to love reading too. While you read, be mindful of the magic of the situation. You, an adult, are indulging in the pleasure of reading that you may have forgotten in your own grown-up life. You may have spent too much time reading tedious legal documents, academic articles, or worthy self-help books. Instead, read a ghost story and enjoy scaring yourself, like you used to as a kid. Take this to the next level and put a tent in the garden. Then read in your sleeping bag with your torch, or take your tent to a local forest or field. Read a spooky story set in a forest to truly terrify yourself. Just make sure that you take a phone and have someone to rescue you if you get too carried away. Or, of course, bring a friend or group of friends. Start a new trend, the Ghost Stories in the Wild Club. So there's a lovely thought to leave this session on. Pagpa and Binny, great to see you. Thanks for coming tonight. So next month, I'm going to be talking about the literature of outdoors, and it's going to be the theme of books that take us outdoors, help us fall back in love with being outside. So come September, we're possibly all going to be feeling a bit like staying in, drawing in from the cold. And I'm going to give you some excellent reading ideas that will inspire you to go outside again. Then in October, we're going to have some ghost stories. Leading up to Halloween, we're going to have some ghostly books. So if any of you have any ideas that you want to share with me, please do. Tell me any of your thoughts. Send me an email, send me a message on Instagram, send me a message on Facebook. And thanks so much, everyone, for coming tonight. I'd love to still hear any of your own ideas about travel and literature. And thanks so much for coming. See you next time. Good night.